something about UNCLOS, okay, something about UNCLOS and marine pollution Now, for dealing with marine pollutions, there are many provisions. One of the very important protocols that we have is called as the MARPOL. Okay, this is one type of a treaty that we have signed to deal with the problems of marine pollution. MARPOL is short form of marine pollution. But UNCLOS also has a lot of clauses related to marine pollution. Now, UNCLOS identifies the following types of pollution. See, I do not see if they will ask you very specifically what are the obligations under UNCLOS. But when you're talking about marine issues, marine pollution, you can have a paragraph or use a schematic maybe that these are the issues that UNCLOS ultimately tries to address. Okay, the following types of pollution UNCLOS addresses. Number one is pollution from land. From land, including the land-based activities, discharge of sewage wastes, discharge because of the coastal activities. So from land and from coastal activities. This includes coastal tourism and the rest. The second category of pollution it identifies is pollution because of offshore oil and gas exploration in the continental shelf, plus the fishing along the continental shelf. So whatever are the pollution consequences linked to this are also considered. Third, it also considers dumping of wastes. So historically, okay, before 1970s, there was no provision to monitor the ships dumping the waste in the water. Of course, this dumping of waste continues even now, but it is at least covered under UNCLOS, and it is supposed to be a punitive action to be taken up by the UN if required. So dumping of waste in the oceans. The fourth category that they have taken up is all the consequences of deep sea drilling and deep sea explorations. This includes the seabeds, explorations of the seabed. Then it also talks about pollution which are sourced from vessels. So pollution by ships, and this also includes oil spills. And a major concern is the pollution along SLOC, sea lines of communication. Okay, and the sixth type of pollution is any pollution that is also related to the atmospheric pollution. Pollution related to atmospheric pollution. So if you are discharging anything in the atmosphere, it also impacts the oceans directly or indirectly. Okay, so these are the 6 categories of pollution UNCLOS refers to. Okay, now these are covered under Article 194 and Article 192. Article 194 of UNCLOS, it lists down the pollution, and Article 192, it fixes the responsibilities. Now, two type of countries are responsible for pollution management. One is the coastal state, whichever state or the country where the pollution happens, the coastal state has a stake. Okay, and the second is the flag state. Flag state implies if this is a ship, okay, every ship will have a flag, and this flag is of the country where the ship is registered. Okay, so this the country to which the flag belongs is called as the flag state. So if this is a country and a ship is coming from here towards this area here, and for whatever reason this area has pollution, then this coastal state is responsible, and the ship registered in whichever country, the country here which is registering the ship. So even this country is responsible for this pollution, okay, of the marine area. So the categories of pollution that UNCLOS lists down and considers as pollution, and it fixes the responsibility on which government. It fixes the responsibility on two type of governments. The government that is responsible for the coastal country, and the government responsible for the flag state. So now you have a fair idea about the UNCLOS provisions, and that the responsibility lies with the flag state and the responsibility lies with the coastal state, the flag state and with the coastal state. Now I want to take up a quick bit of evaluation. I'm trying to evaluate what has been the success and what have been the gaps in the implementation of the UNCLOS provisions and in the implementation of the objectives for marine environment and pollution management under UNCLOS. Now, when UNCLOS was finally concluded, if you remember the year, it was finally concluded in 1982, and then it was put up for ratification. So it was in many ways a momentous, it was a momentous agreement across the countries, and it was heralded under a new type of optimism, because remember this was those times of the Cold Wars, and yet it was a very positive development that countries could come together and formulate a set of laws and principles that would govern tricky issues such as the seas and the jurisdiction over the seas. So it was a momentous event in that sense. A lot of optimism it was received, and it did establish a set of legal principles and framework. What UNCLOS did was it set up a set of legal principles, it set up a type of a legal framework, and this legal framework related to environment have been covered under part 12 of the treaty. Okay, they're covered under part 12, and under part 12 it was specified that the bulk of the responsibilities will be taken up by the members who have signed it, and it has been realized that countries are increasingly willing. The countries have been willing to take up issues of environment under UNCLOS, and countries have also shown willingness to negotiate for sustainable use of biodiversity beyond the areas of their jurisdiction. So I'm talking about the open seas. What I'm saying is that if you look at the treaty, it was a momentous treaty, it was an optimistic treaty. They did set up a set of legal principles that would help the countries decide their agenda. It did set up a set of framework under part 12. So the consequence of this was countries were getting more and more willing to engage with each other on environmental issues of the oceans, and also willing to negotiate for the use of biodiversity in the open seas. The open seas are beyond the natural jurisdiction. Okay? The open seas are beyond their natural national jurisdiction. So countries were willing to engage. So this is more or less the positives that we had under the UNCLOS to deal with the issues of ocean, okay, environment. But now if I am trying to critically evaluate, okay, what were the limitations? What were the limitations? Now, one of the most important limitation is that the clauses under part 12, and I talked about the article 194 and also the article 192 that lists down the responsibilities and obligations. Much of the wordings have been very vague. Okay. The treaty is more like a set of principles, but not very specific in terms of what exactly has to be done. The principles uh, kind of put the responsibility, the principles, they put the responsibility on the coastal states. Okay, they put the responsibility on the flag states, but then it is left to the coastal state and to the flag state to finally formulate laws. The coastal states and the flag states, they are allowed to formulate their own laws, okay, and there is no mechanism to enforce to and ensure that the laws are compatible with the larger objectives. It's like UNCLOS identifies who should do it, but not really detailing what all should be done under the laws, and what if the laws are not in principles with our present wisdom, and what if the laws are not really obeyed. So the punitive part is not very well mentioned. That's why we say the provisions are rather vague. The provisions are more in terms of principle rather than the exactness. See what happens when we talk about laws, it's very important that the laws are precise. Okay. The laws are adaptable. If circumstances change, and we're looking at a very fluid kind of geopolitics, and if the situations change and the laws are not adaptable, the laws will become increasingly obsolete. And the laws should have some element of strong legal binding, along with what could be the punitive or the penalties if the things are not obeyed. Now, this preciseness is what is missing in the UNCLOS provisions. The adaptability is missing to some extent. Why? Because the process of enforcing is strongly controlled by the bureaucracy of the UN and the institutions under UNCLOS. So the provisions are not as adaptable. And we're talking about the geopolitics as they existed during the 1970s and 80s. If you look at the present day political conflicts and issues, the situation is far more different than what it was back then. And we have not had much of a movement to make the provisions adaptable. And of course, the issue of legal binding. So this kind of makes the provisions not very adequate to address the problems of environment. The third problem, if you look at the third issue is that much of the provisions under UNCLOS deal with pollution actually. I have listed down the six issues which the UNCLOS will take up, which includes a sixth one where I mentioned that UNCLOS would also look into the issues related to atmosphere and ocean interaction. So somewhere we are talking about the global warming induced consequences on the oceans. But the list of provisions are heavily tilted towards pollution issues. So the environmental problems are not comprehensively dealt with. Pollution is handled, but then under pollution, a very new and a very malignant type of pollution is what's called as the plastic pollution. Now, plastic pollution is not at all handled well. And again, understand these laws were, the provisions were made way back in the 1970s and 80s, when the plastic pollution was not as big a problem. So we're talking about pollutions in terms of dumping, pollutions in terms of the discharges from the coastal states, but the plastic pollution element is almost missing. Okay, then while the scope under pollution is limited, a very important aspect of marine environment impact is the consequence of overfishing. The consequence of overfishing. Now, the UNCLOS principles again does talk about fishing, but what it talks about is that the states, I'm talking about the flag states, the vessel which is fishing, and the country where the flag state, where the vessel is registered. In fishing, the flag state and the coastal states have the responsibility to maintain and restore stocks. That's the wording. They have the responsibility to maintain and to restore stocks of fishes, okay, for maximum yield. Okay. Now, this phrasing tells us that the focus of managing fishing is more in terms of economic rationality rather than managing fishing and use of biodiversity on the ecological principles basis. So the idea to maintain and restore stocks for maximum yield, it's rather vague again. What do we mean by maintaining for maximum yield? It uses the word called as optimum fishing in the EEZ. Now, who defines what is under optimum fishing? So under UNCLOS, the scope of the environmental issues is very limited. Pollution does not include the plastic pollution, which is perhaps one of the biggest challenges, and the problems does not include how to deal with the problems of overfishing, and overfishing not merely in terms of economic sustainability, but more in terms of ecological sustainability. So the scope of UNCLOS therefore becomes, okay, not comprehensive to deal with all aspects of the environmental problems. And then the problems are also structural. Okay, when I'm listing down, I said the problems include that the provisions are vague, the provisions are not precise and adaptable and not legally binding the way it could have been. The scope is limited. A fourth problem that we have in the UNCLOS environmental issues is a fourth issue. I'm adding it down here. Okay, it includes that there are a lot of structural flaws. There are a lot of structural flaws, and by structural flaws I mean, okay, the type of institutional mechanism required to fulfill the obligations. The institutional mechanisms is very complex. And please understand that all of this was essentially to ensure that the countries do not end up fighting. So rather than having a set of principles which can enforce, the whole idea was to ensure that we don't have conflicts, because of which lot of provisions implementation requires lot of institutional procedures, and that makes the whole process very complex. So there's lot of bureaucracy, okay, that is required to be dealt if you're looking at implementation under the UNCLOS. And plus the issue, okay, of how to deal with non-flag vessels. Think of the problems called as piracy. Now, piracy also is responsible for a lot of environmental problems, be it overfishing, be it smuggling, be it unauthorized use of resources. Now, we do not have much of, okay, say agreement on how to deal with these non-flag vessels. Who will have the control? How will the UN deal with it? Which country has the responsibility of probably enforcing for these kind of rogue players? So there's a lot of vagueness here. So in totality, the provisions are under structural flaws. The provisions are very fragmented. The provisions are not comprehensive. Okay, the provisions lack precision, okay, and they lack adaptability. because of which, despite all the intentions that we have about using the UNCLOS for marine pollution and environmental management, okay, we still have to go a long way. That's why, okay, UNCLOS is not the sole set of principles we follow upon. Apart from UNCLOS, countries have also tried to manage lot of bilateral trade treaties. A lot of bilateral treaties. There are a lot of multi-country agreements that we have, agreements beyond UNCLOS. So in one way, these list of treaties are good, but then the problem is when we have too many treaties beyond UNCLOS, the problem again is about the fragmentation. Okay, so which treaty comes in force where, and which country is obliged to be responsible under which type of agreement, it then becomes a confusion. So all of this together, if you sit down and make a bit of jottings and notes, should help you to analyze and comment on whether UNCLOS has been successful in dealing with environmental issues, or this is probably the beginning beyond which we can develop even more provisions and make it more robust for deal with the environmental pollution problems of the oceans.